Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live, our second of the day. If you've missed our conversation earlier with Charlotte Cates from Sammy Dune, please go listen to that. It was very powerful, inspiring, frustrating, all of that, but a lot of good stuff earlier today with her talking about Palestine from a lot of angles. And, it was a conversation. Obviously, they do work around Palestinian prisoners, but there was, so much more to it that she brought into the conversation that I needed to hear. So I'm sure that's true for others as well. Speaking of things we need to hear in the U.S. Imperial Core, there's a lot of discussion right now about the Venezuelan elections that just took place on July 28th. Um, Before I go further, of course, like the video, subscribe to the channel, contribute on Patreon, share it with folks. I will say something else before I go further, which is that one of the things, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation specifically was also to make sure that people are following the work of Venezuelanalysis. And it's really the best source for English language, fact-based reporting and analysis in Venezuela. They're completely independent and grassroots. They've done a ton of work, building relationships with the communes and the Chavistas, going back for 20 years now. And so for information and the latest analysis of what's going on, it's really the best source. And I say that with all due respect to other people who are doing, that work. There's a lot of folks who have been in Venezuela as election observers and part of delegations, and I think that's really important solidarity work for people to do. And I'm glad that they're also speaking out about the attempts to undermine Venezuelan sovereignty, and meddle in the affairs of Venezuelan elections. But I just want to encourage people that if you really want to get grounded analysis from people who really understand the country deeply, understand the movements and the forces really well, that's the place to go. And so there's a link in the show description also to support them. I know that they're an organization that thrives off of grassroots, small donations. And so, a little bit of money can definitely help, them continue to do their work as well. And so our guest today is Cira Pascual Marquina, who is a writer and editor for Venezuelanalysis.com. She's also a political science professor at the Universidad Bolivariana de Venezuela in Caracas. She is also co-producer and co-host with Chris Gilbert of the Marxist education program Escuela de Cuadros, and so which I think is cadre school. And so the other thing I would just say is I've had a couple of conversations with Cira and with Chris Gilbert before. One of their books is Behind Me, Venezuela, the Present, a Struggle, which is this great collection of interviews with Chavistas, with people in the communes in Venezuela. And I highly recommend it. We did a study group on it a couple of years ago, and I think everybody who participated in that got a lot out of it. So anyways, just wanted to do those plugs before we get into this. Obviously, everybody knows why we're here. We want to get to some grounded analysis of what's going on with the elections, kind of a little bit of background on them, what's at stake, who are the different parties and forces, and, where things stand. We're 3-4 days out since the elections, and there's a lot going on in the Western media that, of course, is not a good source to get any information at all on Venezuela. And so we want to counteract that with some folks who know what's going on much better and can speak to it. And so, Cira, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism again. It's good to be with you.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks so much.
Yeah. So I want to just start with a little bit of context, because it's like we always swoop into these things, out of history or out of, any kind of background. And, what many people may know is there was this election on July 28th that the opposition candidate is claiming that there was fraud in it. President Maduro, according to the Electoral Council, won, and so there's this thing that's kind of playing out in the media. And so, the Venezuelan opposition has boycotted many elections in Venezuela over the year, obviously participated in these elections. There was a range of candidates, and one of those got the primary support of the opposition, as well as capitalists, U.S. imperialists. And so, can you just say a little bit about the two primary candidates in this election, who were Nicolas Maduro and Edmundo Gonzalez, and kind of what they represent, maybe a little bit about what their social bases are within the country?
Sure. Well, thanks again, Jared, and also for the great work you do at Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. So indeed, on Sunday, we had presidential elections in Venezuela. 59% of the Venezuelan people voted. So it was a rather high percentage, especially in a country that, because it's under sanctions, many people are not here, are not in Venezuela at the moment. Many people have been forced by the implications, the economic implications of sanctions to leave. So in the very early hours of Monday morning, the National Electoral Council said that Nicolas Maduro had won by 51%, and the second one, and we'll do a profile on both of them. The second one, who you mentioned, Edmundo Gonzalez, had 44% of the vote. So, who are these two folks? First, Nicolas Maduro, you know him because he's the incumbent. He was elected in 2013, re-elected in 2018. Venezuela's presidential term is 6 years, by the way, and now re-elected in 2024. He is, we could say, the successor of Hugo Chavez. So he is he represents institutionally the continuation of the Bolivarian Revolution, of the Bolivarian process. Of course, over the past few years, the Bolivarian process, since the beginning, actually, of the Bolivarian process, there's been attacks on the process. There's been all sorts of attempts to overthrow the democratically elected president. And over the past few years, specifically since 2014, with the Obama decree, Venezuela has been living under a very brutal sanctions regime imposed by the US, by imperialism. The sanctions have had devastating effects over the Venezuelan population. And then on the far right, as you said, there were quite a few candidates, nine opposition candidates to be precise. But the one that was more visible and who got most of the vote was Edmundo Gonzalez. He's a career diplomat, and he was so-called the unity choice for the US-backed opposition, the fascist opposition. He's an older guy, pretty low energy, but more importantly, he's basically the proxy of Maria Corina Machado. Maria Corina Machado is an opposition figure, a person who has called not only for Venezuela, for the US to impose sanctions on Venezuela, which has been done, but also for military intervention of Venezuela. She also called people to the streets to violent protests in 2014, 2017, and most recently on Monday, she called people to the streets, and there were violent protests then. So there's an outcome of all those protests. There are lives that have been lost, and actually in the hundreds if you tally them all. So for this reason, she is not able to run for an elected post. I think this shouldn't surprise anybody, even anybody on the right, because somebody who calls for intervention of their country and who calls for sanctions and who tells people to go to the street, and they even kill people, they light people on fire. Well, I think that it's pretty unsurprising that she was not able to run. So Edmundo Gonzalez was the other candidate. And well, I think it would be good perhaps to talk about Venezuela's democracy briefly now, but I think it's important to say that Venezuela's democracy is not limited to the electoral to what we could call the liberal democracy path, or what some of us might call the bourgeois democracy. So in the US, of course, every 4 years, people choose their president if they choose to vote or if they can vote. And the options for the elections coming up are basically two representatives of the bourgeoisie, the big options. There are other options that are very important, but we know pretty much that it's going to be one of these two options of representatives of the bourgeoisie. Venezuela's democracy, we could say that it's multi-pronged in the sense that it has, on the one hand, these spaces for a representative democracy, where every 6 years Venezuelans choose their president, every 4 years National Assembly representatives, basically the parliament, and also, but more importantly, what they want to go to is that Venezuela has, since the early days, promotes a different kind of democracy that calls itself participative and protagonic democracy. And this kind of democracy actually is a much more grassroots democracy that's based on assemblies, or in the barrios or in the campo. People organize in communal councils. They assemble several communal councils into a commune. Communes are spaces for deliberation, but also spaces for the transformation of the social relations. So they are the space for the actual building of a new society. They are, we could say, both the path and the end goal for socialism in Venezuela. So I would tell people that as folks who are listening to us, are thinking about Venezuela's election and probably are concerned about Venezuela's recent elections, and especially about after the violent aftermath, I think it's important also to realize, to know that our democracy, that Venezuela's democracy, is far more than what we witnessed on Sunday, which are clean elections in which Nicolas Maduro, the candidate of Chavismo, won.
Yeah, I think that's really important for people to understand. It's something also that comes through in your work and the work of Venezuela analysis on the communes and, the communal councils and all of these different, um, you know, ways that people express the Venezuelan Bolivarian project, the Chavista project, in this protagonistic democracy, right? It's something that um, I wish that I think our movements should aspire to that sort of understanding and that thinking in those projects of radical democracy, because obviously we see um, the horrible choices that we have in our bourgeois democracy in the United States, and you can see the limits of that process. And I think it's important to understand Nicolas Maduro as an important piece in the defense of the Venezuelan radical socialist democratic process, but also understand that it is these communities and these councils and these communes from below that really form the base of the socialistic possibilities and horizons in Venezuelan society. So I really appreciate that. um so let's just talk a little bit about the day of these elections themselves. I know you were on the ground, many people were on the ground there. How did they seem to proceed? Obviously, you know there started to be questions about the irregularities, quote unquote, even before it seemed like the results were released by the electoral council. The opposition has obviously tried to claim that that there's fraud present in the election. And there's been some question, it's been brought up, and you all have reported about it, about that there's been discussion from Maduro, as well as I think the election authorities, about attempts to hack the digital parts of the election, the electoral process. And so, yeah, where does some of those things, kind of sit as well? So I guess that's kind of a two-part question. One is sort of the events of the day of the election itself, and the actual elections, and then there's the question of these questions around fraud and the results, and what are people saying about that?
Yeah, so I think when we think about what happened on the 28th, we cannot forget that actually for months before, the mainstream media, the corporate media, had already, in the global north, had already been saying that Edmundo Gonzalez was going to win. They did so-called polls, some of them paid for, by the way, by the Wall Street Journal, which is, of course, uh, the journal of the US bourgeoisie and specifically of the Wall Street bourgeoisie. And those polls, for instance, gave Edmundo Gonzalez a lead of 20%, the opposition. Uh, the opposition candidate, a lead of 20%. So they have had been cooking it up, I could say. I mean, they had been cooking up a situation, and this is not new, of course. Like in the 2018 elections, the hardcore opposition didn't show up because they said that our electoral process, the Venezuela's electoral process, was not viable. But they have presented themselves to other electoral processes, and in many of them they have lost. I mean, some of them, like in 2015, they actually won. I'm talking about the National Assembly, so our Congress. So what happened on that day? Basically, first, as a journalist in the morning, I went to some polling centers in the east upper middle class area of Caracas. The lines were huge. The lines were very long, but the electoral process is relatively fast. So the lines were moving quickly, and everything was very, very, very peaceful. Um, I took, basically my assessment of the situation at the moment was that was a surprising number of people voting that early, and that everything was going very well. There weren't any reports of problems with the mechanics of the system. We could say Venezuela's electoral system is automatized in the sense that you vote on a machine, which releases a little piece of paper. You check to see if who you voted for appears in that little piece of paper. You put it in a ballot box. Then at the end of the day, there's a tally emitted by the machine, and 54% of the tables are actually contrasted. So to make sure that the tally that the machine emits is the same as the votes on the boxes where you introduce your little ticket, your little vote. So there was that through the day. Then I went to the working class barrio 23 de Enero, to El Panal commune, and to other polling centers in working class neighborhoods. Also, there was a lot of people voting there as is our tradition, as the tradition in Venezuela. People were in the barrios, in the working class neighborhoods. People were happy after they voted. They got together, they talked. Some people danced. It's just like kind of like the usual process that you would expect on a presidential election. Now, what happens afterwards is when things begin to get complicated. The polling centers closed between 6 and 7 because formally they closed at 6, but the law says that you have to let every last person in the line go in. So around 7, most of the polling centers were closed. And basically, the opposition began to already make some declarations pointing, not saying overtly, but more or less saying that they had won. By midnight, a few, like in the very early hours of the 29th, the National Electoral Congress went and delivered the results that we talked about before. The opposition immediately said that those results were false. They gave their own results, and this generated a very tense situation already on the early hours of Tuesday. Very early situation where some people went out to the streets to initiate what we call here guarimbas. Now, why did this happen? And well, some of it may have been planned by imperialism, who knows? But also, people had been told not that they were going to opposition people, which there are obviously in the millions, had been told that they were going to win. They had been told once and again that they were going to win. And Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez said that they had won. So this naturally, obviously, kind of like generates a response from some sectors of society. And so Monday was a very, very, very tense day. There were guarimbas, so these very violent street protests through the city, very close to Miraflores Palace, which is the presidential palace. There was kind of like a situation where a police kind of like a metal police station was toppled over, and these kids kind of like pushed it. They were very violent. They also were armed. There were many instances of barricades built with tires that were set on fire. So Monday was a very stressful day for most Venezuelans, for Chavistas because we think we had won, and for opposition people too, because they also, they also had been led to think that they had won. Monday goes through. Basically, Monday, everything, with the exception of these guarimbas, there was very little going on in the street. In the morning, I had to go somewhere. Generally, it would take me 15 minutes to come back from where I went. It took me about 2 hours and a half to come back because I had to go around, well, everything from guarimbas to roadblocks to police blocks. I mean, there was a very tense and very difficult situation in the street. But Tuesday comes around, and of course, Chavistas are not going to stay sitting at home. On Tuesday, there was a massive march to Miraflores. I marched, everybody marched. It was a little bit reminiscent of the counter coup in 2002. You may remember that in 2002, there was a coup against Chavez that actually was a successful coup for about 48 hours. So it was a little bit reminiscent of that moment when for that march that happened on Tuesday, because people from the barrios, from all around the city, went to Miraflores. It was really wonderful. People were both happy to have won, but also very stressed by the situation, but mostly with a disposition to struggle for what is theirs. Things begin to change little by little in terms of the street situation. The violence on Monday and Tuesday was very intense. I should say not only in the streets, there were also stormings of PSV, which is the Socialist Party, of the PSV houses. People were threatened. PSV Chavistas were threatened. So the intensity of the violence was in many facets of society, and people also had on Sunday and especially Monday, they did what you call cacerolazos, which is a popular protest where you go out with your pan and with a spoon and you make a lot of noise with that. And that, of course, it's a like an understandable expression of dissent from these people who thought that they had won. The problem were the violent situations in the street. Also, I should add that on Monday the cacerolazo was very strong. On Tuesday it was softer, and by yesterday in my neighborhood there were like 2 or 3 cacerolas that we could hear. So there's been a dwindling down of these, and also a dwindling down of the street violence. There are a fair amount of people who have been locked up because they participated in these protests, in these violent protests. So that's a little bit of an account of what has happened over the past few days. Every day since Tuesday, there was another march yesterday to Miraflores, a march today, a march tomorrow, and there will be a big march again on Saturday. So this is kind of like how the popular bases of Chavismo are responding. They are responding pacifically, but they are also responding with force in the streets.
Yeah, thank you for all of that and giving us that, that kind of rundown of things that have been going on. And I think I just wanted to say too something just to say is like, um, when you're describing the election process, like, I just want our audience to be clear, like, that's a more secure process than what we have in the United States. This video, probably YouTube won't like me saying that, and they may demonetize this video, but I don't care. It's important to say that, like, we usually, like, fill out a bubble on, like, a Scantron sheet, and then that goes into a machine, and all we get is some certification that the machine has scanned what we put in there, but we don't actually get any verification from any system that says, this is who you voted for, like, so you have a record, so what they have in their system related to you. And so it has that double layer of security, um and obviously, if something in the electronic system is hacked, then obviously there's also the sort of the paper physical records. And it's also important to say, I think at some point, some of the polling places, the opposition folks tried to destroy some of the records. Is that right?
Actually, yes, that's important. I should have mentioned it, and thank you for bringing it up. And we'll go back to the whole situation with the hacking. Yes, not in a few, but in many, many polling centers, there were attempts to storm them by by people from the opposition, which is rather absurd and contradictory in principle, except that obviously there was a plan to hack the system. Why do I say it's absurd? Because Venezuela's electoral law allows for witnesses from each of the party to participate, and in most of the polling center, they can participate in any polling center if X party says that they want to, that so and so is going to be their witness. That person will get a certification and will be able to enter and follow through the tally process, through the recounting process, and so on. So, in most electoral polling centers, probably not all, because Venezuela is a big country, but certainly in all urban polling centers, there were witnesses, opposition witnesses. People talk a lot about international observers. There were 900 international observers. That's also important to highlight. But I think it's more important to highlight that there were witnesses from the opposition parties in most polling centers. So, and then there was the situation which there was hacking or an attack on the system. And according to Venezuelan electoral law too, there's the first bulletin that's submitted by the CNE, the National Electoral Council, which was submitted, as I said, in the very early hours of the 29th. And then eventually, there has to be a release of a tally electoral center per electoral center. And that's where the hack seems to have incided in that, and the release of these tallies polling center per polling center has not been done yet, has not happened yet because of the hack. Of course, you might think, well, it's supposed to be a proof as a bulletproof system and so on, but the truth is that there have been prior attacks on the electoral system, on polling centers, and so on, and imperialism has a pretty robust arm. So there's no reason to doubt that there had been a hacking, that there was a hacking, not an attempt, but actually that there was hacking. But there are all these other, like backup systems that ensure that the process is good. So eventually we will get the tallies. So there's that. No, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think that's just important for people to understand too, because I think one of the things that the Western media is trying to say, and there was I don't remember if it was, I think it was Butcher Blinken, who the other day said too, like, we're running out of patience with the amount of time this is taking, which, I mean, U.S. elections take time, yeah, I don't even, if I know if I mention Gore Bush, that they'll get really frustrated with me and probably give me demonetize this video. But just to say that there's a lot of precedents within U.S. elections, and also with this most recent one, with the Trump Biden election in 2020. there were things that were disputed, and there were cases, and so it's not unusual for a country to not it's actually more unusual for a country to immediately produce full certified results of their elections. You know, often what happens is similar to what happened in Venezuela, where they say enough information has been tallied that we can predict that Maduro will be the winner of this election, but it will take a little while before all the results are finalized and verified. And obviously, if the system is hacked, then that's going to be a longer process too, to be able to produce everything. And so, yeah, maybe we can take it from there, because I think one of the things to talk about is sort of how Nicolas Maduro has responded to this, to what's going on. Like, how is he handling the situation? Obviously, there is this kind of international pressure as well that is mounting, which we know is primarily being driven by the US and other parts of Western imperialism. But you know, where do kind of things sit there, and what is he step forward and kind of doing in this process?
Well, every day there has been an address to the nation from Nicolas Maduro, but perhaps more importantly, yesterday, which was Wednesday, Maduro requested the Supreme Court to review the July 28th presidential election results, citing the need to clarify the opposition allegations of fraud, and basically asking the Supreme Court to intercede in the situation. And this is kind of like part and parcel of like of a process. So we are expecting. It was introduced to Venezuela's Supreme Court, has an electoral court, subcourt, we could say. So it was introduced in that court, and eventually they will release some information. For now, I mean, obviously it's not going to be from one day to the next. Indeed, as you were mentioning before, in the Biden-Trump elections, I think it took weeks for the final, like the totalization to actually be released by the federal government, I guess, or maybe by the states and the sum up. This is more or less where we are. This was the response. This has been kind of like the most kind of like tangible response from Maduro going to the Supreme Court. What has happened since then is what you have been saying. The corporate media, the pro-imperialist media, is questioning the issue with the tallies. He's saying that the tallies have to be released now, etc., etc. They are doing frankly, what they are supposed to be doing. Nothing else can be expected of them. And then there have been other interesting things that have been happening recently. Yesterday, also, the OAS, the Organization of American States, was wanting to release a resolution in relation to Venezuela's electoral process. And of course, it wasn't sympathetic because the OAS is pretty much a mouthpiece of the United States. So they were not able to release it because even though countries like Argentina, with Milei, with fascists at the head, and Panama and Costa Rica, República Dominicana, Peru, were in favor of releasing it, there were a number of abstentions, a large number of abstentions, and a number of countries that were absent. So this was obviously an important step for the imperialist machine in terms of denying the results, the results of the elections in Venezuela, and they did not succeed. Interestingly, they did not succeed with that step. And actually, just a few hours ago, and today is Thursday, just a few hours ago, two representatives, Debbie Westman, a Democrat, and Mario Diaz-Balart, a Republican, a draft of a resolution has been leaked. I imagine intentionally leaked, probably by themselves, because this is part of the propaganda machine. And it's a House resolution to recognize Edmundo Gonzalez as the president-elect of Venezuela. Now, this is very, very concerning. Remember Guaido. Juan Guaido is the person who self-proclaimed as president in 2019, and the situation got very, very complex around that time, and basically it was a coup attempt. And so these two representatives are kind of like trying to repeat. Frankly, they are trying to do something that didn't work the first time around, and I don't know why they would think that it works the second time around. But certainly, in terms of the media and in terms of generating an opinion in their favor, well, it has the consequences that we know. No, it's like every the corporate media and some people in the global north who are not so informed, thinking that indeed these were not fair, clean, fair elections here in Venezuela. So that's a little bit of the context. Now, when we talk about free and fair elections, I think people, I think that there's something that I like to emphasize these days is that people often say, ask me if Venezuela's elections are free and fair. And I actually will say no, because Venezuela is a country that's under siege. And the Bolivarian process has things stacked against itself, from the sanctions to the multiple attempts to overthrow the Nicolás Maduro government. So the situation is not free and fair, not because Chavismo is stealing the results, but rather because actually the imperialist interests and the bourgeois interests have a lot in their favor. And that I think is important to highlight when we think about the elections in Venezuela.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you making that point, and I think it's really important for us to understand in the United States as the best thing that we could possibly do in terms of supporting real democracy in Venezuela would be to work as hard as we could to stop the U.S. sanctions of Venezuela and allow the Venezuelan people the opportunity to to continue their project without the devastating sanctions and economic warfare. um and obviously we need to be resistant to any of these attempts, also by our government to try to intervene in the elections as well. And it's just interesting, I had to look it up because I was just curious to look up who the two representatives are, and of course they're both from Florida. They both have a heavy Cuban expat community that they and one of them actually, his aunt was Fidel Castro's first wife, and he's now a far right Republican. And so anyway, interesting, connections there between, of course, the kind of the conservative Cuban right in Florida, and this bill that's now before or is in committee or whatever, wherever it is in the process, but that's being proposed to recognize the opposition candidate, who there's, I mean, that the funniest thing to me in some respects is like you said, the kind of Guaido 2.0 is that, again, it's not even an attempt to really prove that their candidate won. It's just an attempt to kind of seems to be an attempt to kind of make the process seem like it was unfair, and then anoint this person as the president, even if they weren't actually elected. And that's very similar to what happened with Juan Guaido, not that long ago. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah, well, if I
Mm,
can say something about
yeah,
sanctions, about the impact of sanctions, which
please.
uh, basically I totally agree with you, Gerard, that people should write to their representatives and express their dissent with sanctions, that they are against sanctions. And it's important because the number of people who have died are in the tens, if not in the hundreds of thousands in Venezuela because of the US sanctions. It's really war by other means, what has been happening here since 2014, but especially since 2016, 17, 1819 when things got really intense. So Venezuela is an oil producing country. It actually has the largest reserves. One can ask themselves, why is the US so set in overthrowing the president of this country, Venezuela, which is not so big, like a population of some 30 million people? And of course, one of the reasons, one but not all of the reasons, is because Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserve in the world. There are other reasons, I think. That's not the only reason. I think there are reasons such as that this project, and that's linked to the fact that Venezuela has this big oil reserve, and beginning in 2001, with a law promoted by Chavez, Venezuela took control of its oil. So this is all linked to sovereignty. And the US, it doesn't look very well on projects that are sovereign. And not only is the Bolivarian process committed to sovereignty, but also Chavez promoted Latin American integration. So the building of a bloc that would be sovereign and that could kind of like make decisions aside from the interests of the United States, both economically, politically, socially, etc. So that's another strike against the Bolivarian process. But of course, the Bolivarian process declared itself anti-imperialist in 2004 and socialist in 2006. And I think that all those elements are strikes against the Bolivarian process, and that's why we are leaving this cruel sanctions regime in Venezuela, with the terrible implications of not only people dying here, and like we could go on and we do a program on the impact on sanctions, but I actually want to highlight also that indeed there has been a very large flow of migrants out of Venezuela, and the main reason for that is precisely the sanctions. Like when wages are really low, when with hyperinflation, we don't have hyperinflation now, but with hyperinflation as we had it a couple of years ago, obviously people look for alternatives, and they are going wherever they can. And that's for those who are concerned about Venezuelan migrants pouring into the U.S., as indeed they are pouring into the U.S. If that's a concern of them, I mean, I'm for open borders, but if that's a concern for somebody, then they should actually be against the sanctions, because it's what's generating the situation. So at Venezuelanalysis, we actually put a book a few months ago, which is called A War Without Bombs, that actually goes into the impact of the U.S. sanctions. So I would, if anybody is interested in learning a little bit more, I would tell them to turn to our website, but also to the book. But yeah, the situation is very difficult. That doesn't mean, I think I would like to highlight here that Venezuelans do not assume themselves, or many Venezuelans don't assume themselves as victims. And this is a really extraordinary thing about Venezuelan people. Venezuelans have been resistant, and not only have they been resisting, but in some places, not around the whole country, but in some places they have been building an alternative, which is what we were talking about early on, which are the communes. No, the communes being the spaces where the political and economic, where there's a reorganization of politics and of economy from the grassroots in the territory. So I think it's important to talk about communes when we think about sanctions, because communes, when they truly exist, they have been able to give. Not only are they a marvelous possibility for the future, communes are in construction. Communes are not fully developed. They, of course, have encountered many problems, many barriers. Venezuela is a capitalist country. So building a capitalist country that is under siege, so building an alternative society in the middle of this situation is rather complex. But where communes exist, not only can you see the future, a better future emerging, but you're also in communes, people are able to respond to the problems of people better, because if you have means of production that are collectively run, and if people decide collectively in assembly what to do with the surplus, which is not being kept by a bourgeois, by a capitalist, but it's going to the people, then in the worst times, well, communes put their surplus to buy medicines, or even in the worst and worst of times when a lot of people were dying because we had both the sanctions and COVID, and people didn't have how to bury their loved ones. Many communes used some of the surplus to bury their, to help people bury their loved ones. So communes are a space where the most complete democracy potentially expresses itself. And those people who are building communes, the people who are building communes, they do not assume themselves as victims. I mean, they know they are suffering, they know about the blockade, but they assume themselves as subjects of transformation, and that's really extraordinary.
I think that's an important point, and maybe that we could say a little bit too about um, the constituencies that we saw in this election too. I'm interested in, it definitely seemed as though, as you've described, like that the Chavistas, the people who were involved in the communes and things like this, that these were folks that were mobilizing in support of Nicolas Maduro, especially, when it became clear that, the election was being contested, right? And I'm interested too, though, in like what composes the opposition, because obviously, we could say, the bourgeoisie, but I'm sure that they're clearly based on, even if they ended up with 40 some percent or something like that, that they're pulling from other sectors of society, and a lot of that is probably a result of the impacts of the sanctions as well. So how does that? How do you see the kind of basis of those electoral projects?
Well, indeed, not everybody who voted was a bourgeois, a capitalist, because Venezuela doesn't have so many capitalists, and mm, not even that. Also, middle class and working class people voted. So in large numbers, actually, for Venezuela, for the opposition candidate. There's no need to not say it. It is true. Actually, I remember that once when there was a defeat with Chavez. Chavez called them oligarchas, the people who had voted, and Fidel Castro from Cuba said, "No, you don't have so many millions of oligarchas in Venezuela," and Chavez himself corrected. So, okay, so the profile. Of course, the program of Edmundo González and María Corina Machado is a program of the bourgeoisie, like privatization, like opening to U.S. corporations, etc., etc. Well, it is the predictable program of the right wing, actually, of the extreme right wing, because for instance, Maria Corina Machado and the fascist president of Argentina are actually friends and have expressed solidarity with each other. Very sweet. So that's the actual context in terms of the program. So their program is the program of the bourgeoisie, but now there have been people from all sectors of society who have voted for them. And in fact, when the one thing that's interesting, kind of like anecdotically, but it should be read with precision too, is that in the 2014 and in the 2016 guarimbas, they happened in the middle and upper middle class neighborhoods. And this time, the guarimbas actually happened in the working class neighborhoods. Now, you could ask, why was it coordinated? I think that there probably was an element of coordination, and the people who were coordinating it didn't want to have guarimbas in their neighborhood once again, which is a real nuisance, to put it lightly, no? But there were people, but there are also, as I said, there were people who had been made to be convinced that they would win, and some people probably went out to the streets spontaneously. Um, so the profile is, like, of course, all the bourgeoisie would have voted. I mean, not all of them, but 99.999% of the bourgeoisie must have voted for Edmundo González, and a lot of the middle class, and definitely some of the working class also voted for Edmundo González. Why? Well, I mean, there's so many reasons. Life is actually not easy in Venezuela. as we said, from the sanctions. There are sectors that are discontent with some policies from the government, and they didn't know how to channel it other than voting against the government. So it's in that sense, it's in that sense I could say that what happened is the normal kind of like liberal democracy vote that where the right-wing bourgeois project doesn't necessarily express itself only with middle class and bourgeois votes, but it goes throughout society. It's in that sense, Venezuela is uh, I don't know, normal country. I don't know how to say it. A country that that doesn't derive from that situation, global situation, in the context of elections.
Yeah, thank you. Another question I had about it was kind of like, how has the what's the international? I mean, we know who the people are who are, supporting the opposition internationally, and who are, either saying that the election was stolen, or like really trying to pressure. Um, and I should say too, with that bill, like, the other thing that's important is that they're not just recognizing the other candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, but they're also calling for new sanctions, right? And that's another thing that people should definitely, respond against, if that actually is something that gets to a place where it's being put forward as a bill, which it seems like is likely. Um, but I'm curious about other countries in Latin America, because obviously there's a range of countries, some of whom, as we talked about with the OAS, right, are basically, kind of client states of US imperialism, or that's how they function, on a kind of international level. Um, and then there are some that are more left-leaning governments in Latin America. And so I'm curious how, some of those other countries, so far, how do they seem to be treating the situation as it's currently unfolding?
So let's say on the blog that is on the US aligned blog, Panama, Peru, I have the list here, Dominican Republic, Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica have expressed very overtly their questioning of Venezuela's electoral process, and Venezuela has actually broken relations with them. Then there are some in the middle, like Colombia. Borg has also been in Chile, has also been very has questioned the electoral process. So those would be there's some in the middle, and then of course on the left, Bolivia and Mexico, which always promotes sovereignty of countries, and more so with Morena right now. Cuba and several CARICOM countries have expressed their support of the process. So there is, there's an array of countries that have actually expressed their concern, and this is actually also a snapshot of the Latin America that we have today. It's not actually even Brazil has been a little bit, Lula has been a little bit wavering. So this is a snapshot of the Latin America that we have today. It's not the Latin America of Hugo Chavez of the 2000s, when there was a robust movement, the so-called pink wave. Right now, well, there has been a significant entrance of fascist and fascistoid and right-wing governments throughout Latin America, and that's something that we have to recognize. So that's a little bit of the geopolitical situation in our continent. No, Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution, the Bolivarian process is wonderful, but it has problems, of course, like any process of transformation. And it should be the Venezuelan people who decide how to fix whatever problems there might be in this country. I mean, this is a country under siege and so on. We've already made emphasis in that. But, like the Venezuelan people decided that it was with Nicolas Maduro. And it should be the Venezuelan people who decide not only that, but also how they might fix problems that actually exist. Like for myself, I would like there to be more support of communes. And other people might have other readings of the situation. But this is not for people from abroad, for the US or for Peru to decide. It is for the Venezuelan people to debate and to go forward in this process of change, in this process of generating a new kind of democracy, and also with a socialist horizon that should be communal.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to start to wind down. I think again I want to encourage people to, log on to the website, follow you all on social media, and also check out the YouTube channel that you all have. You've been doing some live streams. You may do, I don't know, do you have any more of those planned?
We do not have one planned right now because we are addressing a lot of calls for
Yeah.
like yourself, which is very important, to also be on other media, because that reaches different folks. So thanks for that. Thanks for inviting us.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, anytime you all are welcome. And so maybe then we should just close out with like, are there things that you're paying most attention to right now, or, concern? Like, it sounds like you think that some of the mobilizations have wound down. Obviously, they could pick back up. What are some of the things you're monitoring or waiting for, or looking at, you and other folks at Venezuelanalysis right now?
So indeed, the street violence has went down. So, and actually, until yesterday, there was no public buses, no system, no bus system happening going around. That's restarted. So things are beginning to normalize, and there's these Chavista mobilizations. But we have to be aware that the violence could reemerge. It's not too likely, but it's not impossible either. So that's one thing that we have to look at. I think we, of course, need to look at this situation with the bill that's being promoted in the United States. I think there's been a sort of a slight easing of sanctions over the last 3 or 4 months by the US. It should be highlighted, and they haven't done it out of their good heart. They've done it because the US, of course, has several imperialist wars, and one against the people of Palestine, a genocidal war. But that war has implications beyond Gaza, and it could grow. So I think that if we, to the degree that we've seen an easing of a slight, very slight easing of sanctions in relation to oil, I think some sectors of the U.S. imperialist bourgeoisie will try to maintain this easing of sanctions, and another sector, like the Gusano sector, the anti-Cuba and anti-Venezuela sector, will pull for more sanctions. So I don't know how this will, like what pull will be stronger, but this is something worth looking. No, in this, in terms of the U.S., it's worth looking at which one of these two tendencies is going to have more leverage to pull it in their own direction. And of course, I mean, I would say in general, the mainstream media, we know what they are going to say. Are they going to maintain the intensity of the attacks against the Venezuelan democratic system or not? We don't know. Like if the government is able to release the tally soon, that probably will is kind of like reduce a little bit of the sanctions, but the tensions. But actually, we really don't know what will happen, because whenever they release something, I think that the opposition is almost for sure going to say that there was fraud, just the same. So I don't have a crystal ball. I think we should be concerned about Venezuela, but also hopeful. We should also be happy that Nicolas Maduro won, not because of himself, but because of the process. Like it allows, this wonderful process to go on with all its contradictions, but with its marvelous project of building communes. So I would say that those would be the things that we would be looking at in the next few days. As we see how things develop here in Venezuela. We will, of course, be covering them from Venezuelanalysis. And thank you for your kind words on our work here.
I mean every one of them. And yes, I will be following, and I encourage everybody else to do the same. Cira Pascual Marquina, it's been great to be in discussion with you today.
Thank you so much, Irad. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.